So good evening, everyone. So I am about to, and I'm delighted to, welcome you all to the 7th Annual Conference of the European Association of Israel Studies. As chair of the organisation, I am delighted to be able to do that. Each conference, each year, it seems to me that we go from strength to strength. And the strengths of the conference are these. It's a comfortable place to debate, discuss, and share our research in the area of Israel studies right across all the disciplines that Israel studies spreads into, which means that this conference is unique. If it can be a little bit unique, it's a little bit unique. By which I mean that there is something that brings us all together, which is the study of Israel. There's something that separates us because we're looking at it from different perspectives. And there's something that interests us because sometimes it's just nice to listen to people who are talking about something that you don't research yourself. And it gives you a connection that says, okay, so that's how they're looking at it, which is a little bit similar to the way I look at it and a little bit different. And this sort of cross-fertilization, I think, leads to some very interesting conversations. Conversations in the questions and answers, conversations that take place during the conference, in many ways at the most important parts of the conference, which are over the coffee, and since we're in the UK, over the tea, and while we're hunting down the food. And we mix together and we talk about the sessions and we complain that who's chairing these and why isn't it in the brochure and so on and so forth, and why is the brochure so late, so on and so forth. All these little things that bring us together and unite us in thinking how we might be able to plan a conference much better than everybody else. And I'm sure you all can. But, we're doing our best here. And in each of the conferences that I personally have been to, which I've sort of lost count now, but it's got to be no more than 7 because they only have been 7, things have gradually got better. Things can only get better. They are getting better. We can all join in and sing about it, but things are getting better. And what I'm pleased about, particularly about this conference, is already there's a nice familiar atmosphere of people that have been before and people that are sharing experiences and meeting up again. And making those introductions and continuing those friendships, which is all great. And also, who can object to being in London in the summer? It's fantastic. Exactly. So we've got an interesting conference. We've got some good things going on. We've already had something good that's gone on. That was Alec Mishuri. Alec Mishuri gave us the privilege of an introduction to the pre-Raphaelites in the Tate Gallery today. And we stood outside in a sort of typical Israeli-style tour where you stand outside and you make a little group and you talk to us and explained pre-Raphaelites. I hate to have to admit it, but I didn't know very much about pre-Raphaelites. I now know a little bit more about pre-Raphaelites, but what's different is I'm actually interested, whereas before I wasn't very interested. And for those of you who came, I'm sure you'll agree and join in my thank you to him for his efforts and his voluntary sharing of his knowledge. It was great. And it was a really good way of starting. So the 40 or so people who came on that, good decision. The rest of the conference, we have great speakers here. We're going to hear Yoram Peri tonight. And he's going to be sharing some very interesting thoughts. I know this because I checked it out beforehand. I'm very happy with Yoram's choice of subject. I'm sure you will find as we go along that that's something that you'll also be interested in. We've got Hillel Cohen. Great. We've got Rantel showing his film. Fantastic. In between, we've got lots of interesting panels. In addition to that, we've got a plenary discussion that's taking place on Tuesday. in which we're getting people together. It appears in the brochure. It doesn't actually say what we're talking about. You know, these are issues that will crop up in the course of the conference. And Yoram's going to lead a discussion of that, and as we'll see, he's a great communicator, and that's definitely going to be worth coming to as well. So, this evening, the way it's going to work is that I'm going to introduce, in a moment, Colin Schindler. I'm going to introduce Yoram. Afterwards, we're going to go across the road. We're going to cross the courtyard. We're going to have the opportunity to have some wine, some cold drinks, some little nibbles, and conversation, which is the main thing. And if you're still hungry after that, there are lots of good restaurants around. Be my guest. Okay, so if I can now call upon Colin Schindler, who is going to particularly mark the fact that this is the 10th anniversary. You know, there have been 3 presidents, 3 chairmen of this organisation, Colin, Clive Jones, myself. And Colin, for many years, took on the burden of setting it up and justifying it, and can explain and look back briefly, which he's going to do in a moment. So, Colin, if I can invite you up. So, Professor Colin Schindler, ladies and gentlemen.
I think the formal brochure said I should welcome you. Many of you have been here several times before, and indeed, for myself personally, it's wonderful to see so many familiar faces. It's becoming a real sense of commonality in terms of Israel studies. Now, although this is the 7th conference, the European Association of Israel Studies was actually founded 10 years ago. And I'll come to that in a minute. But since I've had absolutely nothing to do with this conference, I've been, you get to a stage in your life where you join the House of Lords, so to speak, the metaphorical House of Lords. So it really falls to me to thank Alan and Anna and the executive of the European Association for putting this on, for working very hard, for making an incredible effort, for doing this not simply a couple of weeks before, but throughout the year, and for making 10 years a reality. I'd also like to thank SOAS. Valerie Amos isn't here today, but we have a conference 1 year at SOAS and 1 year abroad. So, for example, we've been to Munich, we've been to Sardinia, we've been to Wrocław in Poland last year. And next year will be, for at least those of us who live in London, abroad. So that's how it works. None of this could be done also without the help of the Pears Foundation. So Trevor Pears sitting up there. If it hadn't been for the Pears Foundation providing seed money, none of this would have taken place. The European Association would have fallen flat on its face from the first day. So in those 10 years, a lot has been achieved. Israel studies is not an invention. It's not a figment of one's imagination. 10 years ago, Ilan Troen, who had been very involved in the Association of Israel Studies per se, which was mainly Americans and Israelis, came to London, and I persuaded him to talk on a Sunday afternoon, like today, and I put out an invitation to academics in Britain. And I had no idea how many people would turn up. You know, if it had been a handful, I would have been pleased. 30 people turned up. And that's when the European Association of Israel Studies was founded. And what it showed, and what subsequent events have shown, is that it wasn't an invented subject. It wasn't Hasbara, to put it bluntly. But that there was a genuine need, a genuine interest, a fascination with the vagaries of the Israel-Palestine conflict, for example. amongst a wide number of people, Jews, non-Jews, from all walks of life. And that meeting on that Sunday, 10 years ago, November 2009, suggested that there was a genuine need for a European Association of Israel Studies. When I went to my first EAIS meeting, which hundreds and hundreds of people, I felt I was representing the entire British Empire. There was hardly any Europeans there. So now there is at least this network. Israel Studies takes place from Iberia in the west to Siberia in the east. Now, you may think that's a joke, Siberia. I went to a conference in Siberia about 6-7 years ago. There's 6 universities in Siberia that teach Israel Studies. And they should be involved with such deliberations here today. One person I'd like to mention in particular who is no longer with us, it's Paul Webley. He was the director of SOAS before Valerie Amos. He died of cancer a couple of years ago. And I don't need to explain that SOAS perhaps is not always terribly favorable to the events in Israel. And Paul Webley always defended the right to a different viewpoint, a different opinion. And for me personally, they've developed part of Senate House, which is next to it. And it's called the Paul Webley Wing. And it's very moving for myself personally to go in there and to see this building named after him from someone who was a very decent human being and who assisted Israel Studies. Now, talking to Yoram just now, and we've known each other, I think 40 years. He used to live off the Finchley Road when he was doing his doctorate. So it's been a long time. Yoram wrote a very interesting article which was published in Haaretz a couple of days ago. And it drew attention to, how shall I put it, the difficulties of the age, of the time that we are living in. And I think it's important that we as academics note this, that our responsibility as academics is to strive for objectivity, to maintain our integrity, not to bow to pressure from outside, not to bend history to the agenda of other people, and indeed to strive for intellectual honesty, and to strengthen the walls of the classroom. Within the classroom, all opinions are valid. We should entertain free opinion, free speech, free narrative, even if we disagree with it personally. And I think the times that we are living in challenge this. The European Association of Israel Studies has a charter. We are politically neutral. But outside it, of course, we can be as politically active as we like. And indeed, some of us are. So, let me finish by saying welcome to London, welcome to the European Association of Israel Studies, and let our deliberations and our proceedings go in the spirit that we have been accustomed to, one of academic integrity and responsibility for the striving for truth, factually and evidentially based. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. We will all try to live up to that. Among those that we should also mention in our thanks are the Israel Institute. Though the representatives of the Institute weren't able to be at the conference on this occasion, they have provided a great deal of support, for which we're also grateful. So, now it's time for the highlight of the evening. For those of you who don't know Yoram Peri, I urge you to take the opportunity during this conference to exchange a few words and get to know Yoram, because he's a great and interesting guy. Yoram has had a career in politics as advisors. He's had a career in the media. He's also had a career in academia, which is continuing. He's successful in all of these. And when he speaks, he brings together these experiences and he mixes the analysis with the empirical experience of being there. So I always find him entertaining, and I'm sure you will. So without further ado, welcome Yoram, our keynote speaker of the night.
Thank you, Alan, for your warm and kind words. Thank you for inviting me here. It really gives me not only a pleasure, but an emotional element, because I spent very many years in London and I love this place. I think that I'm the only Israeli who continues to read The Economist, there are others as well, but also the New Statesman. And I used to read the New Society until the very last days of its existence. Gadi Yatziv, few of you knew him, tried to build something similar to the New Society in Al Mishmar, and then New Society closed down. So I really look back at the years that I studied at LSE, and I will never forget only one story. You know that they had then, when I studied there, they had a lift, which was an open lift without a door. The lift didn't stop in the different floors.
It's called the Paternoster.
It went up slowly and went down slowly, and you jumped into the lift and out of the lift. And the years that I spent there, there was no accident. Thinking of it in our modern world, so a lot has changed in London. I thought that as everybody celebrates the 70th anniversary of Israel and talk about the 70 years, I thought that I embark on a very, very dangerous project and try to do something to explain an interesting phenomena. And that is that the Israeli condition, or the Israeli experiment, or the Israeli project was always a puzzle, a riddle for the researchers of the Israeli society. Each one of them tried, very many of them, not each one, tried to explain, to understand Israeli society from a different angle, using different paradigm, different approach, different model, different explanation. Most of them started with a sentence, and you'll find that sentence in very, very, very many of the articles and books, saying that the Israeli case is sui generis. For 50 years, that was the basic concept. Israel is a unique case that cannot be explained by looking at other cases. Only in 1996, Michael Barnett wrote his book, Israel in Comparative Perspective, in which he said, it's not a unique case. And you can see it in different ways. But and since then, very few are arguing that it's a sui generis. But both concepts, both those who say that it's a unique case and those who think that it's not a unique case, do base their arguments on comparative models. And they say that their paradigm, their model, or their prism is the one that explains Israel best. So, being here after 70 years of the establishment of the state, I thought that we should try and do analysis of the major, the most important paradigms or models, you can call it whatever you want. Naturally, you cannot describe all of them in 1 hour. It has to be some way simplistic and superficial. Whoever wants to read more about it, I present Uri Ram, who sits over there, who wrote an excellent book called Israel Society, Text and Context, which was published a year ago, in which he did something similar. He looked at the different sociological models in these 50 years. and also an article that he published in Megamot in Hebrew last year on the same topic. So I really recommend that excellent analysis. But my attempt is to do something else, not only to discuss the sociological approach, but also political science, mainly other fields of social science, and also history, and to put them all together. So before I continue, I want to ask you, how many of you are sociologists? Who are the sociologists? Anthropologists could fall, okay. Historians? Political scientists? What are the rest? Literature? Literature? Cultural studies. All right. I still see some people that didn't say anything. All right, so we have a very interesting mix of people. So let me start. Naturally, the 50s and the 60s. The first paradigm, or the first model, or the first prism, was that of Eisenstadt, our teacher, and his followers, or his co-workers, if you want to call them like that, Rivka Bar Yosef, Yonina Talmon, and others. In 1967, he published his book, Israel Society. Before that, he wrote some articles and he spoke, and all the students of Israeli sociology began their career with his approach. The period was the developing towns, the developing states, we don't call them anymore like that, the developing states of the third world, process of modernization, state formation, development studies, nation building, state building, immigration, absorption of immigration. That was the period. And Eisenstadt analyzed Israeli society by using this functionalist, structuralist model of Parsons, and asked himself, how does the order exist? What keeps the order as it is? How does it prevail? That particular model of modernization continued to stay until these very days, in a different way, but by fewer people, but still exists, with the concept of multi-modernity and hybrid modernity, or liquid modernity of Zygmunt Bauer. During that period, there were two other attempts which very few people remember. One was that of Yechezkel Dror, political scientist from Hebrew University. Public policy was his major field. And he looked at Israel as a small state. I remember his lectures. He said, if you want to understand this new phenomena of Israel, look at Holland, look at Denmark, and you understand how Israel works. Because these are small states, and the ingredients, the elements, the most important characteristics of small states apply also to Israel. There was no follow-up to that concept. Even he himself left it. Israel is not a small world anymore, a small state anymore, with 8 million people. But there are some interesting. Sorry. But there are some elements of Israeli society which can be explained by using some of the terms that Dror spoke about. For example, centralism, the tendency of Israeli politics to be centralized, or government to be centralized, or pressure for consensus. It's easier to put pressure for people for consensus in a small society. The familiarity and informality of Israeli culture, society. So there are some interesting things, but that paradigm was not developed anymore. Another paradigm was used by Daniel Elazar from Bar Ilan, who said, what a question, Israel is a Jewish state. So we have to look at the previous Jewish states and to see the similarity between the first kingdom, the second kingdom, and Israel. And he wrote several articles and books on that issue, but he was the only one. It wasn't developed. Yet there is an excellent article by Shlomo Avineri that I'm sure that many of you use in your classes that explains the basis of Israeli democracy, looking into the democratic procedures in the different kehilot during the diaspora. It's an excellent article. And lately, in the last several years, there is a revival of that concept by several people. One of the reasons is the change that took place in understanding the role of religion in present time societies. When we left the old dichotomy that we studied by Geertz about modernity versus religiosity, and we understand that religiosity is not necessarily something that you don't see in modern societies, there is a revival of that concept of Jewish state, not in the political science way that Daniel Elazar used, but in other ways. And you can see some articles by Chaim Gantz, Yoram Chazoni, Aryeh Sharkansky, and mainly Michael Walter in his voluminous work on Jewish political tradition. Just a few months ago, he published his third volume of Jewish political tradition, in which he deals with Israel, looking into the Jewish element, the religious element in that. I won't go into details, I don't have time, but we can discuss it later if you want. The fourth stage was a reaction to Eisenstadt, and here was a real paradigm shift to understand the Israeli society. Eisenstadt based his perception, his opinion on the Weberian tradition, put the emphasis on ideology, on consensus. Yossi Gorny did the same in history. Ideology was the way through which he explained the history of Zionism in Israel. The change was moving towards looking at the society from the point of view, model, again, the same way, of conflict, using Koser, and power of C.W. Mills, and the power elite, Pareto and Michels. In sociology, it was Jonathan Shapira from Tel Aviv University who did it. In political science, it was done by the movement from structure to agent, from the work of Binyamin Aktzin, that we still remember, to political behavior of Asher Arian. So that was that group. A fifth prism is that of the disciples of Eisenstadt, and the two most important of which are Dan Horowitz, Dindush, and Moshe Lisak. Both discussed the different cleavages in Israeli society: the national, religious, political, ethnic, and they developed a concept or a model of the deep divided society. And the question was, what are the accommodation arrangements that keep that society together? One of the explanations was that of Arndt Leibhardt of consociationalism, which applies to Holland, Belgium, and Lebanon. So you see the comparison. That concept continued to be developed and taught in all classes of Israeli society and politics, and became very popular lately since the beginning of the talking about tribes, Baruch Kimmerling, and particularly now that the president of Israel is talking about the 4 tribes, so everybody's talking about that, and there is a special project at different places to discuss the tribes. So that's the deep divided society. We are moving now to the 6th approach, which is the critical approach, or I should say critical approaches. It studied when new fields developed of women's studies, cultural studies, and other new fields, and it emphasizes not so much the order and the consensus, but really control. The first one of them was Ian Lustig, who wrote a book on the Israeli Arabs in 1980, in which it explained the control mechanism by which the Arabs in Israel are being held together with the Jews. So it's not the consensus and ideology, it's control and power. Sami Samocha, who is sitting here, I think, wrote then of the forced domination, the same concept of control. And from then, the way was open to the understanding of Israeli society where the relations between Jews and Arabs is at the center of the discussion. So we got into the very varied analysis of Israeli democracy. Sami Samocha wrote then, Israel is a special case of ethnic democracy. Meron Ben Benishti wrote about the Herren folk, Demokratia shel Adonim in Hebrew. Oren Iftachel wrote about ethnocracy, and he compared the Israeli case to Northern Ireland, Canada, Malaysia in different periods. Rouhana and Ghanem spoke about ethnic non-democracy. So the very wide field of analyzing Israeli democracy, or less of democracy, or semi-democracy, or whatever, through this particular prism of the position of the Arabs in Israel. By the way, the issue of what sort of democracy is becoming now very, very interesting and very popular. In the last year or two, when we see the shift into non-liberal democracies, and particularly in Central and Eastern Europe. And what I did in my article that you mentioned was to analyze what happened both in the United States and in these states, and to see how similar Israel is to these cases. I finished that article by saying that the irony of history is that the new elite in Israel that is fighting the Ashkenazi elite who came from Poland are making Israel more Polish than anybody else before. So the issue of democracy was done in this field of critical approach by very many, and we continue to teach it. In the 90s, we moved from the critical paradigm to the radical paradigm. Again, many approaches, not only one. That was the result of the flourishing of the postmodernist theories, post-structuralism, and mainly French thinkers like Foucault, Derrida, Baudrillard, and others, even Latour, Lacan, Lyotard. Teoria ubikoret, theory and criticism, was the major arena, the major field for articles in these issues, the journal that was published by Van Leer Institute, because it was seen too critical, they've changed the editor, and it's not anymore as dramatic as it used to be. But that was really the major tool for that school of thought. And again, there were very many models which fall under this family. Israel is a case of colonialism, post-colonialism, internal colonialism, frontier society, the term used by Gershon Shafir. Kimmerling wrote about immigrant settler state, and Sarah Robinson a year or two ago wrote a new book on liberal settler state. The impact of these schools of thought should not be underestimated, because most, I wonder if most is the right word, but very many MA theses and PhDs, which has been written in the last 10 years, are influenced by these theories. The eighth approach are the Neo-Marxists. The best example is Danny Gutwein, who writes about, who sees the core of everything that happens in Israel in any field by privatization, including the development of the settlements in the territories. Danny Filk wrote about the Israeli populism. And again, in the same family, we should mention the unique contribution of Uri Ram, who wrote, neoliberalism and neo-colonialism shaped the Israeli society for the last 20 years in the article that I quoted earlier. Apartheid is being used within this framework. South Africa is being used more and more, and I'm sure that it will be used even more in the next few years if things will not change. During that period and within that framework, the issue of Israeli militarism was raised. Yagil Levy, Uri Ben Eliezer, and others, and different analyses of the Israeli militarism, beginning with Kimberling and about cultural militarism, Yagil Levy, who wrote about militarism chomrani, material militarism, and others. By the way, last year, 7 books were published in Israel. I was last summer in Israel, and I was amazed to see that 7 new books were published on Israel in different fields, from literature to television and cinema, films, to political science, ended with songs of soldiers, the songs that they write on the walls in the dormitories, or the song that they sing when they do their exercise. And I was amazed to see these 7 books. So I read them all, naturally, and I wrote an article in Haaretz explaining that phenomena. The common denominator was a very clear statement by all these people from different schools of thought that Israeli society is becoming more and more militaristic. It's a fascinating phenomenon. Other forms, which I will not get into, are diasporism. Some people discuss Israel through the prism of diaspora, like India, Armenia, Croatia, etc. Interestingly enough, there was no development of another school of thought, and the beginning of it is only lately, only a few months ago, by Oren Barak from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, who wrote a book on Israel, Lebanon, Turkey, and Tunisia. His argument is that all these states suffer from democratic deficit. And why it happens? Because of 2 major reasons. One is the deep state, a very popular term today in the United States. But he argues that there is a deep state in Israel, and the deep state in Israel is, well, I won't go into details. And the second one is security networks. The concept of security networks was developed by him and some other people, but to argue why Israeli democracy has deficit because of that is a very interesting opinion. And the comparison between Lebanon, Turkey, Tunisia, and Israel and Egypt is fascinating. I tend to not to agree with him totally, because the differences are so deep that I wonder. But it's interesting to see that there is a beginning of analyzing Israel within the framework of the Middle East, which in the past no one did. Now, one paradigm is missing, and this is very odd. And the paradigm that is missing, the binocular that is missing, the prism that is missing, in all these models that I mentioned, is war and what else? The occupation. The occupation is missing here. Now, the occupation did not start 10 years ago or 5 years ago. It's 50 years out of 70 years. It's a major element of the Israeli existence. The war naturally started 100 years ago, and since the state was established.
Yuda Shenav wrote about this.
Sorry?
The occupation.
Sorry?
Yuda Shenav wrote about
I'll get to that. So that's very odd. And I'll tell you a story. It's not the first time that I'm presenting this paper. I presented a summary of it a few months ago in Sde Boker, where they had an excellent conference on Israel, 70 years of Israel. Excellent conference. And I was in a panel with other people who spoke about the Israeli condition. One spoke about it was done on the day when the American embassy was inaugurated in Israel. So one speaker spoke about the beautiful arc that is closed, closing the circle. On one hand, the embassy in Jerusalem. On the other hand, we are having our conference on the graveyard of Ben Gurion. What a beautiful picture. And I was in a shock. And I started my lecture by saying, there's a third element here. Half an hour away from here, 60 Palestinians were killed. It's not part of this arc? It's disconnected? Another gentleman who gave a talk spoke about the Israeli democracy. He's an expert in political theory. So he spoke about the Israeli democracy and American democracy. Beautiful comparison about the heights that these two societies are reaching. And I said politely, do you know of any other democracy that has been controlling a few million people who do not live under democratic rules and laws? It didn't fit into that concept. And it was an excellent way for me to start my conversation. Because my argument is that the political debate in Israel about the conflict, the settlements, the Palestinians, the occupation, brought the academic community to be very sensitive, not to touch it. Because everybody, whatever their opinion are, do not want to be involved in the political debate. They are academics. If I say whatever I say, even they use the word of kibush, if I will use that, I will be attacked immediately politically. So better not to touch it. So the wars were seen as a force on us, and an external phenomena, not integral part of Israeli society. And the occupation is far away. It's over there. It's not part of us. We can discuss Israeli society using any of these theories or models, but one, I'll get to it in a minute, without talking about the war and the occupation. If you look at, as I said, even the term occupation, you know that 60% of the Israelis say there is no occupation. So why should I, as an academic, start writing about occupation? Immediately I'll be portrayed as an anti-Zionist, anti-Israel, anti-Jewish, whatever, anti-Semite. The annual meetings of the Israeli Association of Sociology in the last 10 years had only one session, only one panel, on something that is related to the occupation, namely on the settlers. A comprehensive analysis of these topics began only in the last decade, after 40 years of occupation. And in 2007, a special issue of Israeli sociology dealt with the issue of occupation. Only in 2014, Dani Bartal and Yitzhak Schnell wrote a book on the impact of the occupation on Israeli society, which was a very interesting book because they used a comparative approach of intractable conflicts. So, of course, there are very many papers on different aspects of the occupation. The territories, the settlers, the Palestinians, the attitudes of the Israelis to the settlements, the policies towards the Palestinians. But again, most of them look at the occupation as something as something that is external to Israeli society, not an organic part of Israeli society, and a temporary thing. It's a temporary phenomena. If it's a temporary phenomena, we don't have to put it into the framework of understanding the basic feature, the basic nature of Israeli society. Now, to your comment, what is interesting is that articles and papers and research projects that were done that deal with the occupation, and there are, came only by the radical scholars. Danny Gutwein in his Neo-Marxist approach, others in their colonialism, post-colonialism, neo-colonialism approach, Ariela Azoulay and Adi Ophir in their book, This Regime Which Is Not One. But as I said, the majority of the scholars who do not belong to that radical group do not touch this issue. But what if you think that the way to understand Israel is not to see Israel as a colonial project? Those who take this approach say that Israel is a colonial project not only from 67 but from 48. So what about the majority, I think the majority, or let's say the others, who do not think that Israel is a colonial project? What about those who believe, and I put myself in that group, who believe that Zionism was not a colonial movement, though from 1967 it put us in the terms that were first used by Emmanuel Sivan in a colonial situation. So I believe that there is a time now for development of a new paradigm, which did not exist until now. A paradigm that will put the prolonged war and the occupation at the center of the understanding or the analysis or the explanation of Israeli society. And it should be done by those who are mainstreamers, who do not believe that Israel is a colonial force. The major question that should be asked is what happened in Israeli society? What is there? What is there in the Israeli nature that made the war prolonged war, unending war? And it doesn't seem to change. I mean, everybody in Israel today say, we are going to get, when will there be the next war? And where it will be, whether it will be in Lebanon or in Gaza. The fact that the next war will soon appear, it's obvious. So not what is the impact of the war on Israeli society, but what is there in the Israeli society that makes war continue. And in what sort of regime or society an occupation can continue for so many years, and as most people say, will continue for so many years. I think that it's a very important question that should be raised. There is a beginning of an understanding of that approach by non-radical scholar Uriel Abulov, who develops the new concept relatively, of securitization. In one sentence, the concept of securitization tells you that war is not an objective phenomena, it's socially constructed. If you look at Trump, you see beautifully how he's using the idea of national defense for explaining everything. Why to put tariff on aluminium? Because if we not put tariff on aluminium, it will weaken our national defense. Everything has to do with national defense. And you can see in Israel the same phenomena. And there is a beginning of analysis of Israeli concept of security as a constructed notion rather than a given phenomena. And now we have to develop from there. What causes that? Who wins from the continuation of the war? Yagil Levy wrote about some sociological elements of that. What are the inner causes that prolong the occupation? And naturally, a second question should be asked how the occupation influenced Israeli society. What sort of society has been created in Israel? Not only in a very limited field, but in the wider spectrum, from the nature of the regime to the rising power of the religious forces in Israeli society. It is definitely connected to the occupation. Issues of illegalism that are related to that. the question of violence in Israeli society and the rise of violence in Israeli society. The most important thing, of course, is the rise of the concept of ethno-nationalism up to integral nationalism instead of the nationalism that existed in large circles in Israeli society until a few decades ago. And it even has an impact on interpersonal relations between the sexes, families. All these questions have to do with the fact of the prolonged war on the occupation. And therefore, this paradigm is missing. And the third question that should be raised is what happens to a society that keeps an area under its control with a very large indigenous society that cannot absorb it but do not get rid of it. And that's a very interesting phenomenon, because if you look at other cases, you can see some options that could occur in the Israeli case. In Lebanon, for example, the Maronites absorbed territories with the Shiites, and since then, there's a civil war, continuous civil war in Lebanon. And if not a civil war, a very deep conflict. In other cases, the Lebanese case, you can see another phenomena, and to use Joel Migdal's term, low level of stateness, which is because of the very odd structure of society. In France, there was something else, more dramatic. A political crisis, continuous political crisis during the Fourth Republic, several attempts to military coup, and then a major dramatic political change with the creation of the Fifth Republic. In South Africa, there was another phenomena which I believe is I won't say this sentence. But in South Africa, there was an implosion. Society collapsed from within. So South Africa today is not South Africa of 30 years ago. It's a different state. The state continued to exist. An answer to those who believe that Israel will not exist. Israel will exist, but it will be a different state, a different culture. In South Africa, it's obvious the blacks took over. So there are different options for what will happen if the occupation will continue to exist for a long time. And the last point on that issue is really what happened in the last 2 or 3 years when Israel became so similar to the Central and East European states, which suffer from the same problem of a society that began to develop its national consciousness more or less after the First World War, had to deal with their national identity, but had a large group of foreigners, different people. I'll tell you a story, and I'm going to end in a few words. After Begin took over, sorry.
He didn't take over. He won the election.
Not in '77, but in '81, there was a conference at Tel Aviv University about the elections. So I had 15 minutes, like anybody else, and I told a story without telling what I'm talking about. I told a story about the state, the society, that has two major parties, one on the left, one on the right. The major difference between the two parties is that the left supported the concept that all citizens are members of the collectivity, while the members of the right said only those who have the right blood are the members of the collectivity. The first period after independence, the left was in power, and gradually it moved to the other ones who believed in ethnic nationalism. After 7 or 8 minutes, without saying Israel, Begin, Labour, Likud, nothing. After 6 or 7 minutes, I began to see people looking at me, what am I talking about? So I'm telling you the story of Poland between the two world wars. You draw the conclusions. Now, the left was in power there because of the support of the minorities. And the major supporters of Pilsudski's party were the Jews, 40 people of which were members of the Sejm. The Sejm, or how do you pronounce it? Sejm or Sejm? Sejm. And then it changed to the other direction. So the similarity was unbelievable. The comparison to Poland was not developed by others, but I believe that today, if we want to see a comparison between Israel and other cases, we should really look at the origin of the Zionist movement and Israeli politics, and look at Poland, Hungary, Romania, the Baltics, and think maybe there's something wrong with our belief that we are part of Western Europe. But maybe we are somewhere else. But that's an additional point. My major point is that without analyzing the prolonged war and the prolonged occupation, we will not understand Israeli society. So our generation, and I see a few of us here, probably for them it's too late to do that, but for the younger ones, I call you to pick up the gauntlet. Thank you very much.
Okay, after that interesting and provocative analysis, we've got half an hour or so of question and answers. Yoram is going to deal with the question and answers himself, so please raise your hands.
Yes, please.
Well, first, thank you very much, really, very enlightening and challenging presentation. Very interesting. I just want to comment or to ask again, I'm coming back to your, I think that the occupation has been dealt with and has been studied, but you are branding these who did that as radicals. Maybe it's the other way around. Once you deal with the occupation, you become radical. Because I think that Yuda Shenhav, in a way, in his book about the Green Line, in a way, the argument that he makes, I don't remember if he makes that explicitly or implicitly, but part of it is, and Gershon Shafir does the same thing in an article on that topic, is that it is the occupation that led him to the conclusion that actually we need to go back to 1948. So he became radicalized because he studied the occupation and its impact on the Israeli society.
Let me collect 2 or 3 questions, and then I think more people will be able to talk. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. I'm wondering what about culture, not just cultural studies, but culture in general, Israeli culture, Israeli literature, and also scholarship of Israeli literature. I mean, this is the center of many studies in Hebrew literature, and this is actually the topic of translated works from Arabic to Hebrew, and the topic of works written by Israeli writers. So I think this might add another perspective to what it suggested.
What do you mean by will add? What do you mean by?
I mean that sociology and culture might not be so different.
Mm-hmm.
I mean that works dealing with the occupation, works dealing with the Nakba, translating the Nakba into Hebrew, and joint programs of scholarship and of writers that are done on that topic of the occupation. It's an ongoing project in Israeli literature and in culture, in theater, for example.
Okay. Yes, please.
Yes. I am trying to quote 1 or 2 sentences you mentioned. Why do Israelis accept unending war? What are the underlying causes that prolong the occupation? Now, I am not a sociologist. I have not done research on this subject, but I have spoken with many people of many backgrounds, speaking about specifically what you said. I have a few elements. First, many people tell me, and I believe that there is something to it, that it so happens that Israel was born at a time the Arab world itself was in convulsion. The Arab world is in the, it is said, is in their Middle Age, like Europe. It's not. And one example is the Arab Spring. So many people say in that situation, the best thing is to continue the occupation until we see clearer. I mean, the idea, for example, very common nowadays, or that God forbid we would have given back the Golan because we didn't know there would be a civil war in Syria. We didn't know that it might change in one direction or the other. So the best thing is to hold tight until the dust goes down. So I have heard, I am not saying that I justify this, but you hear that very much.
Okay.
And the second element is about the unending war. You are right, certainly. But there is this floating idea that the wars, the type of wars we have had, putting aside 73, grosso modo, the type of war we have had are bearable in this sense. So this is the price that we have to bear because we live in such an horrible region of the world.
All right. So I'll start. We'll do other rounds with time. I'll start with the third, not a question but comment. This is exactly what most Israelis believe, and this is exactly what I try to tell you that it's wrong. This is the perspective that sees the war and it's an outside cause, a given cause that has nothing to do with our policies, with our beliefs. Assuming that tomorrow the entire Arab world will come and say, let's make peace with Israel. Will Bennett say, okay, let's sign an agreement? No, their ideology is against it. So this is, you will tell, a small group of people, extremists. Let's look for other reasons. Are there economic reasons for keeping the territories? Maybe there are some forces that the economy plays there. I don't give you the answer. I'm asking the question. What in our society makes Israel continue the war and the occupation? The answer about the Arabs, I know. We all know. And we repeat it, and we talk about it, and we write about it. We know that. But what is within us that makes it possible? That's the question. If it's a wrong perception, all right, we'll get to the conclusion that we are beautiful, we are wonderful, we are, as we are, the shining town on the mountain, and we have to do nothing, just to wait. Literature. I forgot the name of the excellent writer who wrote in Hebrew from Haifa University, the book that was published last year, which I quoted in my analysis in Haaretz of the 7 books. Who? Nitza Ben-Dor. There is an unbelievable sentence there in which she took 7, was it 7 or not? Seven major pieces of work by the most well-known Israeli writers, looking at the wars from the Second World War up to the last one that we had. And she argues that Israeli literature does not really deal with wars. It's fascinating. They deal with other things which are related to wars, but they didn't really attack the question that I raised. Why there are wars? What happens because of that wars? What brings these wars? So yes, the wars are mentioned in the major Israeli literature, but it doesn't answer clearly the question that I tried to raise. And about Yehuda Shenhav and Gershon Shafir in 67, to make it short, it doesn't matter what brought what. His analysis of 67 made him a radical, or his radical approach made him discussing the 67 boundaries. It doesn't matter. In a way, I think that the fascination, in general terms, their fascination with the new French philosophies brought them to analyze Israeli society in that way, even if there was no war. After all, you can analyze Israeli relations between Ashkenazim and Sfaradim in the same way, so it has nothing to do with the war. And yet, it was more the political, the intellectual theories that made them fascinating. And luckily, they were so sophisticated, most people didn't understand it.
Thank you.
How many people read Theoria and Bikoret and understand Derrida
No, you took it personally.
and understand Lacan? Not very many. But I'm joking. I'm not talking seriously about these theories. Some of them I use them. But I think it's more. I think maybe I'm wrong, but I think it's more the adoption of these theories rather than analyzing the concrete field. All right. Another round. Yes, please.
Yoram, the question that you put regarding the few analysis of the occupation is very right, but I would like to suggest two reasons why there are so few. First, the language barrier. There is a language barrier, the Arabic. You need to read text or to listen and to follow Palestinian politics and so on, the discourse. This is one. And the second, that only recently the acknowledgement that the 67 borders are, let's say, diminished, came to the fore of the Israeli, let's say, mainstream mind. So therefore, the state is not small, but much bigger. The Israeli control system is permanent, and also the settlements are there permanent. So you start seeing studies on the settlements, some by the settlers, some by their opponents. But this is a historical process that we shall to put under the question where the state ends. Now, only recently the acknowledgement that state does not end in 67 line came to the mind of many scholars and non-scholars.
All right. Yes, Sami.
You said that occupation or the West Bank is not external to Israel, it's internal to Israel. You are challenging scholars who assume that the conflict with the Palestinians is external. What are your criteria to distinguish between internal conflict and external conflict? Give me scientific criteria that we can use to show that the conflict with the Palestinian is internal to Israeli society. I'll give you some facts or assumptions which indicate that the conflict is external. All Israeli governments, including this one, assume in their policies, and this is what they project to the world, that occupation is temporary.
Right.
Right? So if it's temporary, means it's external.
Right.
It's not internal. Okay?
Right.
Now let's take the population of the West Bank and Gaza. Do they see themselves as part of Israel? Of the Israeli state? Do they want to be part of the Israeli state? If it is internal, this means that they will be counted. Now, are Israelis, most Israelis, who still, according to all public opinion polls, that there is a slight majority for partition, right? Still, there is a majority, small majority, declining majority. So, now are Israelis seeing the West Bank as part of Israel? The way they conceive this territory, most Israeli Jews do not go to the territories, do not even visit the territories. I'm talking of Israeli Jews. Arabs of Israel They go frequently there, they spend time, they shop, they send their children to study there, but they don't want this territory to be part of Israel. And they don't see this territory as part of Israel. So why you demand from us as investigators now, not as a politician, that we see this territory as part of Israel? Of course they influence Israel, but the United States influence Israel more than the territories. And the United States is not part of Israel. The EU influences a great deal of Israel. It's not part of Israel. I mean, tell me, give me criteria according to which you decide that these territories are part of Israel.
Okay,
and I am, as a sociologist, when I study Israeli society, I have to include the Palestinian as member of the Israeli society. Right? This is what you are demanding. How can I accept Arabs, the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza as part of Israeli society? They do themselves. Now, even
The Palestinians,
continue the criteria. Bring me
all right.
hard criteria to show that these territories, this conflict is part of Israel,
Okay.
internal Israel.
Yes, please.
I want to, take us a bit deeper still. I want to join in.
Speak up.
I want to join in congratulating you on an extremely thought-provoking talk. I must say it was much more kind of unexpected than I expected.
What did you expect?
Well, the titles are so nice. So I think this is another very interesting problem that throws us back into the Weberian warning that we should distinguish between politics and academics. Because what you are really suggesting is that it's impossible to do that. And I want to ask a big question about the methodology of Weber in suggesting that the power of academics and the power of taking responsibility for politics are different types of agency, which I think is a very, very serious question. And I want to ask you, you gave us a whole list of prismas. I must say that I was kind of bewildered, because you followed the prismas of disciplinary scholarship, and you replaced or confused, I think, them with analysis of Israeli society. You can be a functionalist and having two kinds, or two or three or four types of analysis of Israeli society. You can be a historian, you can be a dedicated old historian and take the perspective of Hillel or the perspective of someone else on the Jewish-Arab conflict. So it's not the methodology. You don't have to be post or pre or that in order to bring in a different analysis. And what you are saying, I think, is not about posting. You are saying something that I think relates to what Sami is saying. You are saying that you cannot give a real account of Israeli society without the occupation. I agree with you. But the question is, how do you give an account of the occupation in terms of Israeli society? And I'll take one example that you wrote, which I think is very, very good. And this is the Bartal analysis. I think Bartal is extremely useful because he shows, and I agree with him, he shows how a situation of unresolved conflict affects the emotional and cognitive understandings of people in conflict towards the conflict on the other side. However, he forgets, and you forget, that when you are talking about a conflict between two societies, one of the main issues is that there are two collectives, both affected by the conflict, whose narratives tend to be more conflictual because of the conflict, and one of the things that is driving them is their understanding, partial, incomplete, barrier of language, their understanding of the other side, and you cannot give an adequate account that will be responsible to one of the groups only by demanding it to see how it is becoming anti-peace by the conflict without giving an analysis of the conflict. So it's a question of, are you doing international relations, or are you talking about an analysis of one of the societies?
I'm not
I
talking
think
about...
that if you talk only about Israeli society, the culture, the economics, the internal wars between Jews and non-Jews, between Jews, religious and non-religious, between capitalists and socialists, these internal conflicts, which you want to replace by looking finally at the conflict and the war, are as important. If you don't bring them in order to see the whole picture, you cannot have an understanding of Israeli society, and you will have to do it by parts if you want to be professional and accurate and holistic. And this is a fascinating question about studying Israeli society, but I don't think that your remedy is a remedy. I think it's just another partial perspective that cannot give us the kind of analysis of Israeli society that we need in order to answer, in part, the academic part of your questions, which still leaves politics to the responsibility of us as citizens and our leaders.
Number one, it will definitely be partial. And I'm sure that 10 years from now, when you organize the 80th anniversary of Israel, someone will give a lecture about the 18 different paradigms that were used. And the new one that one of the young ones will write will be one of them, naturally. That's the way science develops. Second, I'm not talking about Israeli society. I'm talking about the sociology of knowledge. I'm not saying what Israeli society is today. I didn't say anything about that. What I did is try to present the different approaches of academics who try to explain Israeli society and which prisms or models they use. I didn't say which one of them is right, which one of them is wrong. I didn't talk at all about international relations. I didn't talk about the position of the Arab world vis-a-vis Israel. I didn't talk about their policies. What I try to do is a very simple thing, to see what tools have been used by Israeli academics to answer the question, what makes Israeli society tick? And I gave these approaches. And I thought that one approach is missing, one tool is missing, one prism is missing, and that is the war and the occupation. You raised some other questions, but it will take me. Are we going to skip the dinner and the wine? If we're going to skip the wine, I'll be happy to talk about it.
No,
there'll
be a revolution.
But what? With the wine. Yeah, that's a good idea. We can continue with the wine because both of you raised questions that really needs a much deeper and wider analysis, and I can't do it in 2 sentences. Yes, please. But yeah, go ahead.
I would like to suggest that maybe you could be more provocative.
Oh, that's good. I like that. Being in sauce, I like that.
If you start by asking why we don't deal with occupation, etc., academically, maybe we are afraid of the answer, that the answer is not 67. The answer is that Zionism is trapped into occupation. Because Zionism, as a minority movement, had to occupy the country somehow, one way or another. And kibush hashmama and the word kibush comes again and again. And maybe we are trapped in this issue. We could, politically, if I say something political, we could stop. We could decide enough is enough. But it's inherent in Zionism. I don't know if from the beginning, but at some point after the Balfour Declaration, which gave us some legitimacy to by step. And if you remember the Peel program, the Peel partition plan, it was linked to transfer. The transfer of the Arab minority from the small Jewish state to somewhere in the Jordan Valley probably, etc., etc. And during the War of Independence, we were very happy to conquer the Galilee, which was not in the map. And Ben Gurion at 47 already thought about it. So maybe I don't know what is the answer, but I think we must. I don't know if we must. We could ask the question.
Sure. Can you just repeat the question for the people that couldn't hear?
All right. To repeat the question, how shall I put it in one sentence? Maybe the answer to the question
is inherent in Zionism.
Right. The occupation is inherent in Zionism before 67, before 48 even, with the beginning of the Zionist movement. This is, all right, shall I take one more question? Two more and then we'll close. Yes, please.
I just wanted to follow up on that because Ari Shavit in his book My Promised Land is actually hinting.
Ari Shavit. Yeah.
He's not an academician, he's a journalist, but I think he's actually searching for the cause of the permanent conflict in this direction.
Yeah. All right. Yes, please.
And I just would like to bring the question back to a historiographical plane because you've been talking about prisms and the schools of thought and the different disciplines. And so I'm wondering, what are the chances that some European, given that we are the European Association of Israel Studies, but also foreign scholarship can be ever included in this, given that the numbers of studies on the occupation and the effects of the occupation in Israeli psyche and society on, and many other security and so on have existed for quite a long time. If you take French scholarship or Italian scholarship, English, and US as well. So given that scholarship, of course, has a national dimension, but also aims to be more universal or international, I wonder whether there will ever be a chance to have these kind of scholarships also included in this debate.
Thank you for your question. I will start with yours. It's quite simple. What you presented is the school of thought that I described as the radicals. This is exactly what they say. This is exactly what they say. It didn't start in 67. It didn't start even in 48. It started with the beginning of Zionism. The whole concept of Zionism was to bring Jews to an area that was inhabited by Palestinians and to occupy it. Reminds me of a story. I used to work with Lova Eliav when he was the General Secretary of the Labour Party. And he always told me fantastic stories. One of them was about the wife of the president. The wife of the Israeli president was an Eretz Israel Shlema fighter. No. Who?
Which president?
All right. So he took her in 67 from Israel, from Jerusalem to Ramallah. And they drove in the car, and he expressed it in a beautiful way. He said, and she told him, "Look at the territories on the right and on the left. Look at the empty land that is there." And Lova said, "I see people living there. Look at the empty land." So the radicals say that it's built in, it's ingrained in the Zionist concept. If I do not believe, or if an academic researcher wants to look at it without taking that perception, agreeing that the Jews have the right for self-determination like anybody else, like the Palestinians, and it was not, how can he explain it without it? If you will not find a way, maybe we'll have to all join this school of thought, including you. I don't know. But to answer your question, that's a very good question, and it's a beautiful way to close this session. We are, at the Israel Studies Review, we have asked our friend to have a special issue on European perspective on Israel studies. And we want to see whether there are particular perspectives that are European perspectives, which are not Israeli or Americans. And if it will be a good collection, we can have more than one issue, 2 or 3 issues. Maybe, in a way, a European perspective would be excellent, because from the outside you see things that you can't see from the inside. It's much easier to see things from the outside than from the inside. This is why I've changed some of my positions in the last 7 years since I moved to the United States. And when I get back to Israel in 3 years, I will join the Likud, probably. So an outside perspective has an advantage, and I call you to do that and write to the journal. Thank you very much.